Chapter 3 The Sword. Alv awoke next morning with the first gray glimmer of dawn in his eyes, and a driving urgency in his mind. For a moment, bewildered, he could hardly remember what it was. The events of the night had turned his old world wholly upside down. Then he remembered. His second trial piece. The master had said it. Today the work would begin. He suddenly felt very empty and helpless. The puzzles of the night retreating before a new and immediate problem. A helm of fine mail, and in it a virtue of concealment, of change, of moving subtly and unseen. Virtues indeed. He knew something of them, how to charm a jewel setting so it tended to turn away thievish eyes, to work a sword hilt so in action its blade would blur before the eyes of an unwary opponent. But these were light powers, minor charms added to some greater work. Little use if their existence was suspected. Making them strong, making them work together as the living heart of a piece, the difficulty of it loomed over him like a wall. He panicked. He didn't have the faintest idea where to begin. And yet if he was to have any chance of ever finding Kara again, he'd have to. He slumped down despondently. It seemed monstrously unfair, a task like that. Surely the master smith hadn't said anything so hard to Inger the booklouse, Inger of the parchment anvil. Then the weight lifted so suddenly, he laughed aloud. Of course! The second and third pieces weren't supposed to be things an apprentice could manage on his own. They were meant to stretch him, as well as test him. Well, it would, this one. And now that he was able to think more clearly, he thought he could see a clue in the very form of the thing. Chainmail. A whole made up of thousands of tiny, separate pieces. Like the elements of a living body, said the master-smith, and nodded. You see clearly, as I have always said. Each link a distinct work in itself, with its own particular virtue, some of one kind, some another. Weak in themselves, for it is hard to make such negative virtues strong, but joined together into a single thing, with an identity of its own, then they become strong. Alv nodded, tracing the archaic words on the great scroll spread out before them. Einhir Elof Alns Steimer, Stalans Imars Olnir Elof. There is made, he translated slowly, running his finger from word to word. One alone, a whole, into a whole. I mean, of power, surpassing, by many, being linked. Why does it repeat one alone? A copyist's mistake? Hardly, said the master-smith sardonically, since the copyist was I. It is a poetic form of alofer, an even more archaic term for smith, literally shaper. Used here in the dative as a scholar's pun, and to heighten the assonance of the lines. I incline to think that it is important in your chant. Use these lines, and keep as much assonance as you can in the lines around them. You see their meaning now? The smith makes single things strong by combining them into a greater identity. Remember, identity is important. The more so, the greater the virtue in an object. If a portion of the helm is ill-made, the whole thing fails, and you must needs begin again. And if it was damaged, Master Smith? That would depend on the extent and type of the damage. A few broken rings would not ruin it altogether, though they would weaken it. Replace them exactly, if you can, and it will revive. But anything that destroyed its identity as a helm would surely destroy its virtue altogether. So though you would not wear it as armor to ward off blows, it must be made strong in metal and frame, as the pattern shows. Go as far as you can with it. Ask my help at need. And when I judge you have done enough, I shall complete it. But you will need to study first. There is a text on ringmail in the Southron tongue, which you may find useful, somewhere on the east wall, and various odd passages in other books. And you must read some works on the powers of concealment in the guise of forms. You will find some references on the slate below the pattern. You may study to your heart's content the first scroll of the Alvarthan, and my own notes on the Fjoth characters, added to the 3rd chapter of the Book of Tarn. I may find others as you plan your work. Begin now. The first thing Alv did was seize the large slate with its precious pattern, and scan eagerly through the references. There were many texts from east and west walls he had not, so far, been allowed to read, but still none from the north. He sternly repressed the cloud of disappointment that settled about him. Why should he expect his master to scatter his hard-earned lore before mere apprentices? Surely, the quickest way to it was to get on with the task in hand, to the utter limit of his ability. And this he did. This time his preparation took not 1 week, but 4. He soaked himself in every authority he could find, till at times he had to force himself away from the books, head buzzing, and find relief in simpler tasks. Rock watched all this with cynical amusement, brought Alv the occasional meal, and loudly blessed the powers that had never made him a magesmith. But for all his concentration, there were other thoughts nagging away at Alv. Some were of Kara, though those he could escape by reminding himself that this work was also his quickest way to her. But there were some, however trifling, that he could not escape, for he was reminded of them on almost every page or column of scroll he came to. Somewhere on them, often across the bottom left, he would almost always find slightly chalky smudges. He wiped them off carefully, in case he was blamed for them. The mastersmith cared for his library, and remained mildly puzzled as to their cause. He had not yet found it, however, by the time he felt ready to begin. With the mastersmith's wire-drawing devices, he had made great coils of heavy wire in many metals, copper and gold, and delicately alloyed steel. He had patterns ready to be minutely engraved round the edge of every single ring. He had characters into which the rings would be woven, in carefully balanced combinations, and patterns to be inlaid, embossed, or enameled around the main frame of the helm. And for each of these he had its own chant, distinct but linked as closely as the finished rings. First, though, he made the frame, and that was a simple enough business. It resembled the ordinary light helm worn by warriors for skirmishing or scouting, where swiftness was their best protection. One band of fine bronze circled the brow, 2 hoops crossed the head from front to back and sideways. Between them went a stiff leather lining, and over that, a layer of male rings. The rings hung down in a curtain to shield the back of the neck, and could be fastened across the throat or the lower part of the face. Then he began on the long labor of crafting the rings, engraving the lengths of steel wire and shaping them, not into plain circles, but into peculiar distortions which would let them mesh easier and lie closer, to the good of both armor and virtue. These he would blend piece by minute piece into the pattern, sometimes overlaying them with smaller rings of gold and copper to highlight its lines. It was a long labor, almost another month, and when the mail was complete, he held it up in the light of the forge. It was as if the waterfall had overwhelmed the chamber, for the mail reflected a great shimmering wave of light across the dark walls, and the rings rang and chuckled like water among stones. For a moment, Alf thought of the hillside streams of his childhood, and felt suffocated in this shadowy, seasonless place. Then, shrugging, he turned to the frame, secured the mail to the leather interior, fitted these together to the frame, and hammered the last bronze rivet flat with a die that stamped a binding symbol. "Well?" demanded Rock, who had been holding the die for him. "That's as much as was on the master's pattern. What are you waiting for?" Al stared a doubtful moment at his creation. There seemed to be nothing inconspicuous about that glistening thing. Still, he raised it as if to put it on his head, and the mastersmith reached out and received it graciously. He too looked at it a moment, as if puzzled, and then quickly placed it on his head, smoothing the mail out around his neck. The rings rang more quietly. Nothing else seemed to change, but then the mastersmith reached up and fastened the mail across his face. The rings shone as brightly in the forge light, but somehow the tiny gaps between them grew harder, deeper, more black, until night seemed to seep out of the helm like a thick lamp-black ink. The highlights still shone, but behind them it was as if the mask itself and its wearer drew further and further back into the shadow, blurring, quieting, becoming indistinct. It was like a pond draining and drying in the darkness, leaving nothing but a few gleaming puddles. Knowing someone stood there, Alv and Rock strained their eyes and could just make him out. Otherwise, he would have seemed nothing but one of the insubstantial shadows that darkness creates. In a forest, anywhere with cover, he could have walked unheard, unnoticed, as good as invisible. Behind the young men, the library door swung open. Ingar walked in and stopped short at the sight of Alv and Rock. "Seen the master anywhere? What are you two gaping at?" There was a sudden trill of metal, and the mastersmith stood bareheaded before them, with the helm swinging from one hand. It was Ingar's turn to stare. The younger men whooped with laughter, but Alv's faded in him as he caught a flicker of some deeper disquiet on the journeyman's heavy face. "A pretty enough prentice piece, Ingar. Do you not think so?" inquired the mastersmith with quiet satisfaction. "A fine work," said Ingar, equally quietly. "May I see it?" The mastersmith looked at him a moment before handing it over. He rolled it around in his thick fingers, held the mail work up to the light, and let out a long, slow whistle. There are more powers than one in this, if they can be tapped. Complete it, and that is what I intend to do, said the master-smith calmly, taking it from him. A look passed between them. One Alv caught, but could not understand. But that is beyond Alv's concerns for the moment. Your second piece is accepted, boy, with honor. But now, to your third. Rest now, and what it is you shall learn in the morning. You also, Ingar, and Rock. It is late enough. Sleep you well. But again, Alv found himself unable to sleep. His mind had grown used to racing, and without the effort of the work in hand to distract and exhaust him, it kept him awake long hours into the night, worrying over everything, great or small. What would he be given to create next? Why had Ingar reacted so strangely today? Could it be jealousy, perhaps? What more could the helm do? And, as every night, he thought of Kara. Where was she now? He laughed to himself bitterly. How wide was the world? He had lost her, failed her. A sound of thunder shook him, and he sat bolt upright in bed. A storm? But there'd been no flash at the window. It came again, and this time he knew beyond all doubt. It was coming from below. The great hammers were at work. He sat and listened for a moment. He slipped into his tunic and went to the door. Why wasn't the house in an uproar with that din? And yet, in the intervals, he could hear Inger's snoring drifting down the stairwell. So it had to be the master-smith again, about some secret work. He closed his door and stood there indecisive, torn between his desire to slip down and see what was happening, and his fear of having his immunity found out. There was no telling what the master-smith might do then. Why risk anything now, when he was so near his goal? But the need awoke again in him, that was to rule his whole life. The need to know. And step by hesitant step, it forced him down the cold stairs, through the hall, and down to the echoing forge below. The door was shut, and he did not dare lift the latch. Sound and movement might be noticed. He stooped to the keyhole. It was wide, and he could see right across the forge. There were the plunging shadows of the hammers, but even as he watched, they fell silent, and he shrank back, afraid the master-smith was somehow aware of him. But then he heard the explosive hiss of something being plunged into the quenching trough, and a moment later, the rasp of a heavy file. He dared to look again, and saw the master-smith clearly, at his bench now, working away at something clamped into a large vise. After a few moments, he freed it, picked up something else, tried the two together, and nodded calmly to himself. Then he took a hammer and what looked like a die, and began to tap in rivets. Something rang and rippled as he worked, and Alv felt a sliver of the ice against his spine. It was the helm. The master-smith was completing it. And sure enough, when he had finished, he held it up, just as Alv had, turning it round and round to look for any slight damage. Alv gaped. The helm now had a front to it, an eye mask that looked to be of silver steel, cast in the form of hawk-like glaring eyes. Those were outlined by a thick rope of twisted wires, flattened onto the metal. The hammers must have been for making that and welding it onto the mask. The master-smith stared at this for a moment, then lifted the helm and placed it on his head with careful ceremony, like a crown. He made no move to fasten the concealing mail. For a minute, he strode back and forth, crossing and recrossing the narrow viewpoint of the keyhole. Alv could see his lips moving, but heard no sound. Then a hand swung up to the mail to hide his face. The shadows seemed to deepen, and he strode out of view. Alv waited for him to reappear, but he did not. The moment grew longer and longer, and Alv felt less and less safe where he was. The master-smith, visible or invisible, might come out of that door at any moment. At last he straightened cramped legs and tiptoed slowly and carefully back up the stairs. But when he reached the hall, he froze in horror. There were footsteps on the stairs. He scuttled back into the shadows by the front door and crouched there, quivering with fright, as he saw the master-smith himself, still wearing the helm, but with its mask now open, come down the last few steps, walk casually across the flagstones, and down the stairs Alv had just come up. The stairs, which were the only way down to the forge. Back in his bed, Alv lay awake and brooded. The smith might easily have gone through into the library and up those stairs to the far end of the hall. But then Alv would have heard him, his footsteps, or the creak of the library's heavy outer door. Could the completed helm now mask all these sounds as well? What other, stranger powers did it now confer? Of moving subtly. He drifted off to sleep, trying to draw comfort from a vision of Kara. But why were her eyes so cruel, predatory, hawk-like? This technique is called pattern welding, said the master-smith. Do you remember reading about it? Alv screwed up his eyes. Yes, master-smith, I do. An ancient method of forging a strong blade, when they had little good steel, and no easy way of making it. Indeed, said the master-smith, running his fingers over the short rope of twisted wires. So far, there had been no mention of what the rest had been used for, and Alv was not going to admit he knew. But its very antiquity makes it more than that, for in the course of times it has gathered about it much, much lore. The first great smiths of our kind were taught it by those of the elder kind, and they in turn by the powers that they had revered and abandoned. Like the craft of mail, it takes complexity and makes unity of it, but greater complexity and a more solid unity. Great virtue can be bound up in it by those who have the skill. So, for your trial piece of weaponry, you will make me a sword. But a sword such as you might one day craft for kings. A sword with a virtue of command and obedience, of order and submission. You will prepare everything and shape the blade, but the completion is delicate work, and that may be left to me. It will be long in the forging, many months, I am sure, but when they are over, so will end your apprenticeship, and great things will await us all then, for the world is moving, moving. He paused and sat back, staring into an infinite distance, At length he reached out and tapped the roll of parchment on the table. "Some references to start your studies, boy. More than 1 or 2 slates will hold, as you see. Open it and read." Fascinated, forgetting the mysteries that gathered around him, Alv unrolled the stiff, crackling stuff and read the crabbed script. A page here, a page there. Notes, a chapter. The reading alone would take weeks. "And that is not all," said the master smith somberly. "You will require the ancient text Yiselhain, its first section on the symbols associated with command and dominion. I've made some notes in it of forms I found used by Equish shamans, which appear to resemble many of ours, but in more archaic, purer forms. Also, the Skolnir book, left by a great smith from the East many centuries ago. It has pages on pattern welding, and others on the powers of command." Alv looked at him. "I do not remember even seeing those on the shelves, Master Smith, let alone reading them." "No, indeed," said the Master Smith dryly, "and little it would have profited you if you had read them. They are on the north wall." "I do not remember even seeing..." Alv's eyes widened, and he started to say something, but the smith held up a hand. "Wait. I am not making you free of it. Not yet. Come with me now." They threaded their way between anvils and machines towards the library, where Ingar, scribbling furiously on a slate, paid no attention as they went past. The mastersmith stopped before the racks of scrolls on the north wall, drew out one, and lifted a heavy fanfold book from a high shelf. Alv could see long tongues of parchment protruding from them both. The smith carried them to a table and opened them carefully. He touched the parchment strips. "I marked these for you last night. See, from here to here in the Yiselhain book scroll. And in the Skolnir book, between this marker and this, to the end of this page." He pointed to the end of the leaf, crammed with crabbed black lettering in an archaic cursive script, interspersed with tight little drawings of symbols or elaborately ornamented characters in red and black. One, the distorted face of some crouching beast, grimaced out from beside the master smith's finger. The wide margins were filled with his flowing script. "Thus far, and no further. Do not let your eyes stray to an earlier or a later page, to another book, not even by chance. You would find little profit in anything you chanced to learn." Alv nodded, a little rebelliously. "Very well. And do not take them into the forge. They are too valuable." That was reasonable enough, but Alv, watching the masters retreating back, felt like disobeying it, simply out of spite. It was like having a drink snatched away from your lips after the first sip. What he had done so far might please his master, but not him. He felt he had learned almost nothing from any of it. Not enough to let him strike out confidently on his own, as he planned to do. He might, with luck, be able to reproduce such a bracelet, if he could get the gold. But the helm was another matter. Information had been carefully measured out for him, so that he knew well enough what he was doing, but had only the barest grasp of why. There was nothing he could apply to any other work, and he had not even been allowed to bring it to its full strength, to appreciate all those powers his own skill had invested in it. And now it was happening again. Why? To make sure he'd stay? To tether him firmly to his master's apron strings? He didn't want to believe that. He reined in his temper, remembering the gratitude and admiration he still felt, afraid of hasty judgments. But the doubt still hovered blackly around him. He looked across at Ingar, blissfully engrossed in transferring his notes onto parchment. Does he ever feel like this? Fenced in? Cozened with false hopes? Cheated? Probably not. He had no driving ambition, no great reason for it. Apron strings suited him very well. Ingar tossed down his pen on the slab, scattered fine powder onto the wet page, and threw it aside with a satisfied grunt. Then he snatched up his slates and scrubbed them clean with a fold of his left shirt sleeve. He tossed them down and caught Alv's eyes. "Filthy habit," he said unapologetically. "I can never be bothered hunting for the cloth when I'm busy." "It's sticking out of your pocket," said Alv, striving to keep his voice level. "Ingar, I never did ask you just what your prentice pieces were." "Can't tell you. Not till you're a journeyman yourself. Guild rules, remember? And the master's a stickler for them. He shall nor seek, nor have help or advice save from his own master." "Not like that, ass. All I meant was, I don't remember seeing you bent over an anvil for as long as I look to be." "Should hope not," grunted Ingar. "Guild rules don't undervalue scholarship the way tykes like you do. You can substitute dissertations for the two higher pieces, if your master thinks fit. So I did." He pointedly unrolled the next page of the work he was studying, and leaned forward over it in his customary reading position. Alv nodded slowly, and looked down at the page below him. There was a slight chalk smudge, much the same as the others, including, no doubt, one on the column Ingar now read. The fastidious mastersmith would never treat clothes or books thus. So, Ingar had trodden this ground before him, and read almost every other page Alv had told out to him. Alv drew a deep breath. He could guess just what those dissertations had been about. Deep in his mind, almost sooner than he could admit to himself, his doubt was becoming a certainty. The mastersmith was seeking to tether them both, not only rationing the knowledge he was giving them, but carefully separating it, encouraging them to stay within their specialties. Ingar the scholar, seeking knowledge without the craft to put it into effect. Alv, the man of skills, denied the learning to use them. Both of them less than a whole craftsman. Both of them dependent on their master, doomed to use their gifts for him, as he chose to direct. Black anger rose in Alv's throat, the worse for being wholly helpless. What could he do? There was nobody he could even talk to about it. Ingar had seen it already, last night if not sooner. Alv remembered his strange look when he was confronted with the powerful reality of the helm his studies had given shape. He had seen it, accepted it, perhaps even liked the idea, because it gave him an easy, congenial living without sweating over an anvil. Which is all very fine for him, but me? Where does it leave me? "Right up your own chimney," said Rock, and laughed raucously. Alv glared at him. He had had to talk to someone, and while he had tried to avoid becoming close or familiar with the forge boy, Rock had somehow remained the nearest thing to a friend he had. So in the end, he had swallowed his pride and told him something of what he feared, putting the best possible complexion on it, and with no question of seeking advice. But of course, the first thing Rock said was, "If you want my advice." He seemed to be waiting for Alf to deny it. "If you want my advice," he repeated inexorably, "stick it out, then get out. Getting to be a journeyman, that's the thing. Getting the badge and script. Then push off and find some other bolt hole." "Maybe I don't know enough yet." Rock shrugged. "Pick it up as you go along. The rank's what folk'll pay heed to. Take what you're given and use it. That's what I say." "Maybe you're right," Alf admitted. After all, it was no more than he'd planned, wasn't it? But he hated the idea of leaving without at least some of the unique learning that was here, and was denied him. His anger turned round then, and became a cooler, more calculating thing. "Maybe you're right," he repeated, and Rock looked at him shrewdly. But Alf kept his own counsel then, though he did not cease to think. Go he would, but not without at least some of that special knowledge he could rely on to make his living and let him search for Kara. And he would gain it by turning the master-smith's own methods against him. Since Ingar was so content to be used by his master, why should Alf not make equal use of him? And so he threw himself into what was to be the hardest labor of his life till then. Throughout the long weeks of study, he kept returning, again and again, to those texts from the North Wall. In them, he had at last found a foretaste of the knowledge that he wanted so much, that in truth was as necessary to him as meat to the starving. So strongly did the craft within him burn to find its fullest expression. But what little he learned served only to awaken further that appetite, never satisfying it. Often he felt tempted, driven, to disobey the master-smith's injunctions. But though he was no longer sure he believed the pages were guarded, still he never once dared to let even a page too many fall open. What he was allowed, however, he read and reread, draining the last fine drops of learning from it. And most of all, the master-smith's own notes in the margins. These came from many sources, but the ones he found most illuminating seemed to stem from comparisons with the lore of the Ekwesh. "Indeed," said the master-smith gravely, when Alv sought counsel from him one day. "Their smithcraft is often rough and savage, for it is the preserve of their tribal shamans, who must also be priests, chroniclers, bards, healers, and counselors to the chieftains in peace and war. Their metalworking is elementary, and knows little of fine alloys and precious metals. But they have some special skills, little practiced in more civilized lands. One of these is the use of masks, in which the wearer, as it were, becomes his own living symbol. But these they make chiefly from wood, as yet. I have experimented at combining their skills with ours, and have often found the results very potent." Al thought of the Thunderbird, the beautifully crafted metal death's head within, and the keen, cold mask that now fronted that strange helm. He nodded with polite interest, but said nothing. They are also concerned, continued the master-smith, with the swaying of wills, and that is what makes their work relevant here. In their tribes, where the chieftains enjoy all power of life and death over their people, such things are more easily and openly studied than among our own, and more greatly valued. So I feel that by considering their equivalents, these characters of ours, here and here, could well be modified thus. It was not the first or the last advice he gave. He never hovered over Alv, but he seemed to be constantly on hand when he was needed. His counsel was always good, always helpful when Alv had a choice to make. But about the reasons for that choice, he was given only the most general ideas, little or nothing he could apply to other works. Alv was careful never to appear less than satisfied and delighted with what he was given, choking down the frustration he felt. And in truth, he often forgot it, as the sword seemed to take shape among the piles of slate and parchment before him. More than once he dreamed of this, of sliding his fingers down among the litter of papers and touching cold metal there, but metal that quivered at his touch and went slithering away through the rustling layers like a snake among fallen leaves. But day by day the image of the sword grew less elusive, more real, till it came to occupy his mind almost to the exclusion of all else. He had not forgotten his other concerns, his fears and hopes and desperate love, but it was as if he poured them into a single mold, and sought to hammer them all out at the same anvil where he would forge the sword. It seemed so clear before him now that his arms grew taut and tense as he sat, impatient to be striking the first hard blows. But he knew where impatience led, and what flamed in his mind he quenched with the cool precision that he would first of all need. For no work he had yet attempted, not even the helm, had been so minute and so complex. And as at last he drew all his patterns together, and scribed the final design onto stiff yellow parchment with a fine silver-tipped quill, he almost quailed at the weight of the work that lay upon him. Five rods of metal would make up the sword, one for the spine, two for the body of the blade, and two, longer and thinner, and of harder stuff, set round the outside to take the fine edge essential to a good weapon. Each of these rods he would make from many strands of metal, twisted together like ropes, and these strands themselves he would in turn twine out of many finer ones, cords and bowstrings, and threads of many metals and alloys, starting with strands thinner than his own fine hair. And each of these would have its own symbols, its own virtues, to be sung into it with its own proper song. He stopped suddenly, pen hovering over the paper like the great condor that had borne it. He had planned them all. He had command of the songs, the symbols, the metals, and surely above all, he had the skills. Then what could he not do? What was lacking in him now for the mastersmith to fulfill? "The 5 rods you will make as you have planned," said the mastersmith approvingly. His dark eyes flashed as he scanned the crammed parchment. "And though I would not entrust it to every apprentice, I see no reason why you should not also make up the spine and body of the blade." "And the edge, master smith?" Alv strained to sound no more than normally eager. The mastersmith smiled faintly. In the edge of a sword is power. In the edge of a sword is what gives meaning to its presence. Force fined down to a cutting thinness, to strike where it will profit most. The final sanction that enforces the command. Given. The body is the command, the threat. The edge is the enforcement, the execution. Without its edge, the sword would only be a dull threat, a club at best, its violence dissipated, ineffective. So the edge is crucial, and must be invested with extra strength. It needs not only the symbols sung into it, it must bear others. He shook his head sadly, and his long, dark hair rustled against the rich collar of his robe. These I cannot trust you with, not yet. They are of my own devising, and difficult to use. Perhaps even dangerous. So I will take that work upon myself. He smiled more widely. But I am sure that you would find the stamp of a journeyman some balm for your pride, at least. We will see. But for now, to your forging. The first days of it were long and wearisome, and they grew to weeks as Alv struggled with the metal that seemed to grow willful under his hands. For him, the passing of time became measured by the chime of hammer on anvil, the slow, deep gasping of the bellows, the verses of the chants that hung leaden on his dry tongue. The mastersmith had predicted he would often fail, and often he did. Most often of all, within reach of success. It was then that an overstrained filament would weaken and snap, or welded cords would part at a blow. Alv would simply stare at the remains and hurl them aside. If it was time then to eat or sleep, he would. Otherwise, with unfailing patience, he would simply start again. He lived to a strict order, never working long hours or missing meals, because he could see that haste would not help him here. Later, it would be forced on him, and he must save his endurance for then. So it was long months before he had even completed enough of the long cords of iron and steel, as thick around as his thumb, that would become the 5 rods. Some were entwined with threads of bronze and gold, others with thinnest webs of rarer materials and fine alloys. But those for the edges were made all of steel, hardened with traces of strange metals and other substances. So far, you have done well, said the mastersmith, and quicker than I feared. Alv looked up sharply and caught Rock's eye. The forge boy shrugged eloquently. Feared? Did it matter how long he took? The mastersmith had never even suggested that. But he did not press the question. The smith was looking odd now, troubled, almost afraid, if you could imagine that in such a man. It seemed to have been growing on him for some time, since that night in the snow, perhaps. He spoke often of the Southlands, though he seemed never to go away now. Alv remembered what Ingar had said, that Louhi's last visit had begun the mastersmith's plans to move here. What had she set in motion now? The mastersmith laid down the length of metal he had been examining. You cannot linger over the rods. Now comes the race. Then the bellows must needs blow faster, and Rock was kept busy topping up the fire pit with coal and charcoal, and silver sand to keep it and the metal clean, till the air shafts could barely cope, and the stink of soot and sulfur hung in the air. Alv bound together 7 of the stiff cords, carefully chosen and matched, with thin wire, and thrust their tips into the glowing heart of the pit, plucked them out an instant later, and beat them together on the anvil. Then they went back to the fire till they glowed red-white, had a cloth wrapped round them, and were jammed into a ring swage set in the anvil's side. Alv set a lever under them, tensed his foot on it, and by the sheer force of his arms and shoulders, twisted the thick metal strands about each other a handspan or so, with the words of his song hissing through his teeth. Then the glow died, and the cords went back to the fire. The bellows wheezed, and again Alv strained till the sweat rolled in rivulets down his forehead. For another handspan or so, the separate strands became a thick, coiled rod, threaded like a screw, coated with gray dust from the fire. But as Alv's fire and strength and song bore down on it, the coating cracked and fell away to uncover the clean, glowing metal. The threads twisted closer and closer until they met and became a single surface, with only a faint coiled tracery to show where they had been. And so, in 20 hours of unstinting, unceasing work, the first rod was made. Each of the others took as long, but on the 10th day after that, they were complete. That night, he slept the long sleep of exhaustion. The next day, at first fight, Alv went upstairs instead of down, up past Ingar's room and the mastersmith's many chambers, right to the tower top. Now was the time that the sword must be made whole, and he wished to clear his mind before beginning anew. And when the great slab had slid back at the stairhead, and he mounted out on the high pavement, he was startled to see only a light frost on the tessellated stone, and mere remnants of snow on the mastersmith's turret and the rocks around. He flexed his muscles, and felt new strength arise in his arms. The wind blew from the south, and the smell of woodland and plain and shore hung on it, all fresh, all new. He breathed deeply, blinking in the daylight, for since he last saw it, he had worked away the winter, and spring would be coming soon. He jumped at the hollow creak from behind him. The turret door was swinging open, and the mastersmith stepped out. He, too, blinked at the light, and its face was drawn and anxious. His rich blue robe was creased, and he looked as if he had not slept. But when he saw Alv, the weariness fell away before his usual suave goodwill. "So, you also seek wisdom on the heights, boy. No doubt about what you must undertake today? No need of my counsel? Good. I am glad, for I fear I must leave you for a day or so. I hate to do so at such a time, but it must be. The world presses on me, as I had hoped it would cease to in this place." Alv smiled ruefully. "I am sorry, Master Smith. It will be difficult, but I am rested and ready." "Good. Then try to have your work completed by tomorrow, when I return." Alv bowed his head to hide the grin he couldn't suppress. He could have asked for nothing better. "Indeed, Master Smith, I will." The gloom of the forge seemed to hang more heavily around him after that, and with it the note of tension in the air. For a while he prowled around the anvil, nervously selecting hammers and shaping tools, and laying them out within easy reach, pinning endless sheets of notes to every surface he could easily see. But at last he took up the rod that was the sword's spine, and the others that were its body, and sang long, slow words over them as he bound them tight in metal bands and thrust them into the fire. Now the note of the bellows changed, for moments of great heat were needed. Alv set Rock to work the piston of the hand bellows, and its quick, panting breath echoed his own as he grasped the rods with pincers and maneuvered them in small circle of blue-white flame. Then he pulled them out in a flurry of cinders, struck 3 quick blows with the heavy hammer, and thrust them back into the fire. After a minute or 2 more, he repeated this, and motioned Rock to stop, letting the wheel-driven bellows take over. He sang when he could, in eerie harmony with the soft song of the charcoal, squinting at his notes and listening for the moment when the sword itself would begin to sing, and spit out a few light sparks, the first sign that the steel itself was beginning to burn, which it must not do. He sang of the tree that had once grown, drinking in the wind and the light of the sun, and of how he had mastered it, cut it down, and burnt it to charcoal, because a time had come for it to give back the air and the fire. He sang of the metal that had lain deep in the veins of the earth, unshaped, unseen, till he had mastered it, dug it out, and purified it, commanded it to take other shapes and forms. As they had been mastered, let wood and metal combine to teach mastery. As they obeyed a mightier command, let them in turn enforce obedience. His words fell into time with the vast, strong breath of the bellows. That mighty ash tree, how boldly it burns, how noble the blaze it's made. To leaping sparks of light it returns, but its strength it leaves to my blade. Bellows, blow, brighten its glow. And when the thin voice came from the steel, the note harmonized with the tones of his chant. That was it. He hauled the body of the sword out, the top of it an erupting fountain of yellow sparks, and struck, and struck, and struck, and struck, till the mighty anvil rang and rocked on its huge hardwood base, twisting the spitting steel this way and that across the anvil, narrowing his eyes against the exploding halos of sun-bright metal. As it darkened, he brandished it at Rock, who sprang to the bellows, and he thrust it deep into the charcoal, twisting it about to clean it. Then, verse after gasped verse, he was wrenching it out again, and striking with all shapes and sizes of hammer. From time to time, he would seize a page of his notes and rush into the library, wiping his hands on any rag he could find. Once or twice, unable to leave what he was doing, he would yell through the open door to Ingar, who fussed and grumbled somewhat, but was willing enough to read out or copy a particular passage or symbol for him. Most often it was to the north wall he was dispatched, to those pages of the Skolnhir book the mastersmith had annotated. Alv's labor was back-breaking, but as he worked through long hours of the day, his intense frown began to lighten. For all his weariness, he was grinning with delight as at last, he plucked the steel from the fire, braced it against the anvil, seized one of his chosen fullering tools, and with minute precision tapped it home to narrow and shape the tip. Rock expected a war whoop of delight as Alv finally plunged the steel into the quenching trough. But when the steam cleared, he was gazing at the narrow dark blade he held with only the faintest and tightest of smiles. He stroked a finger along the raised spine, feeling how smoothly it merged into the sloping surface of the blade. "Is it all right?" Rock demanded Rock. He exchanged anxious glances with Ingar, who had heard the hiss and was peering round the library door.
He hasn't gone and...
Oh no, said Alv quietly. It's fine. It's perfect, in fact. All it needs is... He picked up the 2 remaining rods and clanked them against the thick, dull edges. These. Do you feel up to another few hours of this? Rock stared.
If you do, yes. Once I've had a drink, and a bite, that is. But, you mean you're going to finish?
Yes, of course. But off with you quickly, if you want some food. And bring me something I can eat here. Rock scuttled off, but Ingar stayed, frowning. Wasn't the mastersmith going to? He's in a hurry for it seems, said Alv. Remember I met him on the tower this morning, before he left? He told me he wanted it finished when he gets back tomorrow. So finished it will be. He held the cooling blade out at arm's length, squinting down it for tiny irregularities, and his bright eyes met Ingar's. After a moment, the journeyman turned away, shaking his head in confusion. Whatever you say yourself. Well, I'm going back to my work. Oh, before you do, called Alv, could you just check these characters for me? My hands are covered in soot. He reached out and plucked off 2 leaves of thin parchment he had tacked to a shelf. But hampered by the blade, he missed his grip. They went fluttering into the draught of the fire pit, twisted upwards, and were consumed in an instant. Alv, goggle-eyed, burst out in a stream of curses that raised Ingar's dark eyebrows. My, he said mildly, in his best-bred voice. Really, you must have quite shocked those cattle of yours. Well, don't take them on so. If you remember the references, you can copy them again. Before this cools? I've got to match the edges. Ingar sighed deeply. Oh, very well. If that's important, I suppose I can copy them for you. That's not really helping you. The north wall again? The Skolnir book? What page? Alv remembered the page that set the limits of his knowledge, saw in his mind the ugly, mocking little countenance, and beside it, the mastersmith's forbidding finger, resting on the long parchment marker. The marker he had that morning detached and, without opening the book enough to read, slip in several pages further ahead. Everything beyond the Nakina character, he called, and held his breath. From the library, silence drifted like a freezing cloud. Then there was a sudden rustle of paper, exactly as in Alv's dream. He jumped violently, but then Ingar's voice called out cheerfully. Well, that's only 4 or 5 figures before the chapter ends, and they're simple enough. Do you want the notes as well? If you would. Alv called back, trying to keep the unsteadiness out of his voice. 4 or 5 only? Surely, then, his suspicions had borne rich fruit. All the other symbols from that chapter had ended up in the sword, in one form or another, buried deep now in its twisted heart. So there was a good chance it was the remaining ones the mastersmith planned to incorporate in the edges. How logical, and how typical of him, that there should only be 4 or 5. And on that chance, Alv had taken a greater gamble. Either that there was really no mysterious power shielding the books, or that Ingar would be immune because he'd been through them before in his researches, as the chalk marks proved. The mastersmith wouldn't have bothered stopping him before the crucial page, because he hadn't a quarter the skill to make use of his knowledge. A logical gamble, but a good one, if he'd won. Alv seized an oily rag and wiped down the sooty blade, staring along the thick edges for irregularities that might hamper the welding. Anything to keep busy, to think about something else. He set the thin edge rods to heat near the rim of the fire pit, fixed the blade in the leg vise on the far side of the anvil, and set to work tapping the edges into a gentle curve to match the blade. The purer steel was much harder to work, and he had only just finished the first when Ingar tapped him on the shoulder. He laughed at Alv's convulsive start. "Don't get so wrapped up in your work. You might wreck everything jumping like that. This is what you need, isn't it?" Alv swallowed, and forced himself to look down at the slates clutched in Ingar's plump hand. Yes, it's everything I need. I'll have to work out a couple of my verses again, though." "Well, that you can do for yourself. I'm only a channel, remember? A conduit. I contribute nothing." "And may that save your soft hide for you," thought Alv, "when the mastersmith finds his bluff's been called." But aloud he said, "I thank you, Sir Journeyman. If I get through this—" "Oh, you will, said Ingar patronizingly. "Well, you may labor all the watches of the night, but I don't have to. I'm a tired conduit. And dry, too, with all this smoke in here. Me for a stoop of southern wine, and then bed." "Sleep well," said Alv, and was surprised to find the gratitude in his voice genuine enough. Ingar might infuriate him in any number of ways, but he was not a bad man at heart. Not his fault, perhaps, if he preferred the security of serving the mastersmith to striking out on his own. He'd just never had to struggle for anything. And because he'd never disobeyed the mastersmith, it hadn't occurred to him that Alv would. Well, let one person use you, and others may also. So turns the world. He perched the slates on his workbench and read through them carefully, struggling to make out Ingar's script, which disintegrated when he was hurried. And as Alv did, so the cold certainty grew in him that these strange bastard things were the final symbols, the only ones that would have to show on the surface of the sword, inscribed around the edges, perhaps even inlaid for clearer effect. But that could wait. As long as they were there. But why was he so sure? And what on earth was the right way to arrange them? Difficult, perhaps even dangerous. Rock brought him a bowl of something hot and meaty, and he supped away at it absently while he read. The notes were tantalizing, all about the shape of the characters, hardly anything about their symbolic associations or effects. And yet, as he gazed at the forbidden characters, he seemed to see them in an order, a definite grouping. He clawed at his hair. There was something he recognized, a memory he couldn't quite grasp, but felt was terribly important. A pattern, a web of symbols set in metal. In his mind, he traced and retraced all the studies he could remember, and found nothing like it. Such a faint memory. It seemed to date from a time before he'd come here. His childhood? Impossible. Where would he have seen Smithcraft then? And then memory washed over him with the clear, cold thrill of the waves he'd once played in. That ancient thing, the cattle code, the markings on it. He could see them clearly, glinting in the sunlight. Small wonder when he'd studied them so long. Symbols, of the kind he was using now, one or two among the commoner ones he had already chosen. They were, now he saw them, very like the ones he had set upon the arm ring. A memory of them, perhaps, had inspired his design. But there above them, enclosed in a cartouche of tracery, were counterparts of the characters he was looking at now. Simpler, but unmistakable. A simpler power, possibly. But the way they were arranged, the pattern. His mind seemed literally to spin, the symbols scrawled across the slates tumbling together in a whirlpool, slotting almost of themselves into an arrangement that was intricate, but logical, fluent, perfect. For half an hour or so, he scrawled feverishly on his own slates, terrified that in writing down one thing, he might forget another. But the pattern held its own inner strength, and he had it all, and the song to go with it. Then he was up and running for his anvil. The bowl went clattering unnoticed across the floor. In minutes, he had the second edge worked fine and tight, and he bound both to the body of the blade with wires and metal bands. Ignoring the scorching heat, he leaned out over the fire pit to choose a clear spot, and slowly and gently slid the bound pieces into it. This was the most difficult part. Ordinary pattern-welded swords were made with the edges welded to the body pieces before they were attached to the spine. But the unity that gave the sword its power had to grow from the center outwards, like a leaf. And if, once welded, it broke, then like a leaf it would wither and die, and all his effort go to waste. With long pincers, he lifted the pieces, but swore and pushed them back down. "It's got to be hotter, far hotter."
"Push him in further, then,"
gasped Rock, panting like the hand bellows he worked. "Can't risk that. Too hard to control." Alv bit his lip a moment, then ran to the wheel set in the floor and forced it open a full half-turn. Great gusts of heat came roaring up from below, through the layers of coal and charcoal, sending a high flame up from the heart of the pit to lick at the vaulting. Alv turned to the wheel that controlled the water flow, but it would open no wider. In a burst of sheer fury, he canted the great bellows lever loose and worked it himself. Sweat poured off him. He could hear his shoulders cracking with the effort, but the air blast roared through the pit faster even than the wheel could drive it. A white glow crept outwards towards the rim, sizzling and crackling, spreading around the half-buried blade. "It's going, Rock! It's going! Just one more! Pump, man, pump! And sweat some of that lard off yourself! Here I am breaking my back, and you just sit around twiddling your fingers!" Rock, purple-faced and gasping, threw all his bulk onto the piston of the hand bellows. The fire blew white at its heart, and the steel sang again. Alv caught it out, swung round to the anvil, and caught up his great hammer. To Rock's dazzled eyes, he seemed to vanish in an aura of sparks each time he struck, and every blow rang as hard as the machine hammers. But louder and clearer rang his voice, though few of his words could be heard. "As sundered I found you, in flickering flame. As once then I bound you, I bind you again. Shape, sword, in the firelight. encircle your blade with sharp steel. Almost before Rock could see again, the blade was back in the heat, and he was thrusting and heaving at the bellows once more till his mind grew cloudy. Then again a hammer rang, and the voice echoed it, but more lightly now, and from time to time there came the clang of a tool discarded, another seized. The blade lay wedged on the anvil, its heat turning the smoky air to a rippling velvet curtain. Alv, bending over it, tapping around its rim, became a strange, hunched shadow, his voice no more than a whisper as he worked the chain of characters around the blade. Master my hammer, this stubborn steel, teach it to know my skill's command, that in its turn shall hammer home the will behind its wielder's hand. Then it was back to the fire pit for a moment. A few strokes to flatten the tang and punch it for rivets. The glowing shape poised over the quenching trough. And then there was a loud, searing hiss, like a voice that screamed. A blast of steam leaped upwards and burst across the roof. Boiling droplets rained down over anvil and fire pit with a sizzle and a roar, spattering agony across sweat-ridden skin. Great gusts of steam washed through the reeking air, and murk heavy, condensed like black rain on every metal surface. As the steam blew aside, Alv stood there with the blade in his hand, and he slapped it down on the flat of the great anvil, which tolled like an awesome bell. It is done! But it was not long before dawn when the weary young men at last climbed up the stairs from the forge. The blade had had to be trimmed down with light hammer and file, and soaked for some hours in a bath of weak corrosive to remove surface impurities. Meanwhile, Rock and Alv labored to clean up the forge, which the mastersmith always insisted upon, and make it ready for his return. Alv was acutely aware of his bold disobedience, and in chilly dawn afterthought, it no longer seemed such a marvelous idea. But he had done it, and there it was, and nobody the worse for it. Not even him, for the mastersmith might rage, but he could not deny the power of the work. When Alv took the blade out and washed it, he seemed to see a peculiar sheen, in rather than on the metal, and wondered if he saw with the eyes of a true smith. Rock could see nothing. Alv gave the blade its first edge with the grindstone and finer whetstones, then very carefully wiped the blade with a stronger corrosive, and polished it away at once. The rippling weld patterns, relics of the many strands that made it, ran in strange twists and coils across the blade. He turned it one way in the lamplight, and they seemed to hold depth and perspective, like one of the strange drawings in the mastersmith's southern books, but a very peculiar perspective that suggested immense distance to the eye, and sought to draw it down. It was almost like looking over a cliff. Another way, the light rippled across the patterns, and they suddenly reminded him of the folds and convolutions he had seen on a drawing of the human brain in the mastersmith's great anatomy text. Another way, and they were like some ancient esoteric writing. Very like writing. He could almost read it now. Surely he could catch a word or two. Then he tilted it slightly, and the patterns became that weird suggestion of the abyss once more. At last he wrapped it in soft leather, and tucked it under his arm, and beckoned Rock to follow.
Breakfast?
inquired the forge boy, hopefully, as they came out into the hall. Yes, I'm ravenous. But let's go roust Ingar out of his nice, soft bed first. I want to see what he makes of this.
He'll probably thump us with it. Oh well, I'll hang on.
Alv drummed merrily on the door of Ingar's room. They were not very surprised to get no answer, and kicked the door wide. On your feet, journeymen, and meet your new master! But then they stopped, slightly surprised. Ingar lay peacefully in his bed, sleeping on his side much as usual. But though he was facing the door, he had not stirred at all. Alv stepped forward, grabbed him by one heavy shoulder, and shook him, and then fell backwards with a yell of sheer horror. With a crisp, dry rustle, exactly like the sound in Alv's dream, like the sound in the library, Ingar's body had caved inwards where he lay, collapsed, and crumbled to a heap of dark fragments, like a pile of dry leaves before an autumn wind. Rock, eyes wide, backed slowly out of the room onto the landing, till he could back no further. Alv scrambled up, half fell against the doorframe and out, and stood there staring back into the room. Staring, he knew now, at what he himself had done. The back of his hand was against his mouth, and he bit into it to stifle a scream. The blade dropped, dully ringing, to the floor, and the mastersmith stooped to pick it up. Whether he had come up or down the stairs, they could not say. He was there now, unwrapping the folds of leather, and his dark eyes flared wide in his haggard face as he saw the completed blade within. Then he looked up at them, and quickly passed them to what they had seen. For a minute he stood there expressionless. Then he looked down at the blade in his hand, and complete understanding dawned in his face. He threw back his head and laughed, a rich, carefree laugh, the laugh of sudden release. Then, abruptly, he rounded on them. Well, he smiled, eyes still ice-bright with mirth. So that you were determined to prove yourself, and you have cost me a fine journeyman in the process, though perhaps you didn't quite believe in my sentinel. Now you do. Still, it would seem that I have another journeyman to replace him. The mastersmith's voice had gone vague, almost dreamy, as if he was voicing his thoughts. He raised the hiltless blade high, and Alv could not but flinch, though in truth he would have welcomed being struck down in that hour. But the mastersmith was only examining it. Yes, yes, and there, yes, perfect. Another journeyman, yes, and one who might be capable enough to fill Ingar's shoes as well as his own. For boy, this is craft of great power, master's work. And then, suddenly, he was himself again, gazing at Alv with the same intent look as he had when they first met. Who are you, boy? He whispered, and his hand fell heavy on Alv's shoulder. Where have you sprung from? Who was your father, your mother? What strange hour, what remote place gave you birth? The hand sprang to Alv's chin, tilted it back fiercely, so he staggered on weak legs. In that instant, came a sound Alv had never heard before, echoing through the high windows of the tower. Distant, but deep and clear, like the ghost of a great bell tolling. The mastersmith's hand fell away. Alv staggered and almost toppled down the stairs, but the smith hardly noticed. "Boy, this comes timely," he said softly. "You have pleased me well. Forget the fool. He pays the price of his own stupidity. Later today I shall set the stamp of journeyman upon you. But for now, get you to bed and rest, and you too, Rock, until later." He gestured with the blade, and Alv stumbled away down the stairs, hardly knowing what he was doing, but wanting to be away, to escape, to run till he could run no further. But as they came to his room, Rock thrust him firmly inside and thumped the door shut behind him.
"You!"
Words failed the forge boy, and he almost threw Alv flat on the bed. Alv thrust his head in his hands, unable to think, unable even to weep. The forge boy slumped into the single chair.
"What'd he ever do to you that was worth that? I suppose if he hadn't fallen for it, you'd have tried to cozen me into it."
And then Rock's voice suddenly ran down like a spinning wheel, slowing, slurring, weakening. Alv looked up, startled, and saw the forge boy swaying where he sat, eyes glazed, about to topple onto the floor. The surprise triggered something in him. He sprang forward and hissed in Rock's ear. "It's a spell, an enchantment, something of his. Fight it!" Rock stared up at him and mumbled something. Alv shook him, slapping him, and abruptly the forge boy was awake, eyes wide with horror.
"I was just falling asleep. I couldn't help myself. I was just like something's dragging me down."
"A spell," growled Alv. "He's going out."
"Ah," breathed Rock. "To answer whatever that bell thing was."
He shook his head.
"He was gonna kill you then. You know that? For finishing that sword, not—"
Alv shuddered. "Yes. I wish he had."
"Could be that you'll get your wish soon enough. Meanwhile, we'd better be hopping."
"We?"
"Yes, come on. He'll stick us both, sure as sunrise. Me just in case. And if he doesn't, I reckon something else might, if we stay here. You saw how worried he's been these last few weeks. What might that bell be about then? So I'm off. And I don't give much for my chances alone in these mountains. So you'd better come along, you hear?"
"I hear," mumbled Alv. "If you think I'd be of help, I'll come." In truth, as he realized afterwards, Alv was no help at all, for it was Rock who had to take the lead in everything. It was Rock who listened till he heard the great door thud softly closed. Rock who led their hesitant way downstairs, with Alv trailing behind, in every sense a shadow. Rock who collected clothes and cloaks and boots and swords, and filled wallets with food from the kitchen, with Ernan snoring peacefully in the next room. Alv went and did as he was told, without apparent sense or feeling, save once only. That was when Rock vanished down into the forge and reappeared with a bundle that rang of metal, which he thrust at Alv. Alv fell back as if it contained a poisonous serpent. It was Alv's own set of tools, which all smiths crafted for themselves early in their apprenticeship, and which held an affinity for their hands.
grown too dainty to carry on our own, are we?
Sneered Rock as he gathered up the spilled tools. I'll touch them no more, Alv spat out. They're tainted.
Aye, well, they may be, but tainted or no, they've got to earn us a living once we're out of here. We can't afford to be particular. Speaking of which,
he added hopefully,
you couldn't manage to open his strong room, could you? All that gold.
You saw how he guards his knowledge, Alv grated. Do you imagine he would set any lesser guardian over his wealth?
Pity,
grunted Rock. He shouldered the tools himself, but tossed both food wallets at Alv.
Ah, well, he'd surely hunt us down then. You can manage the gate? So be it. Off we go.
He swung the door wide, but paused and looked around.
Not a bad berth, if you didn't mind the swink. And earnin'. Let's hope you can earn us a better.
Alv drifted out after him, unheeding. At the gate, they delayed long while Alv fumbled with the lock. His fingers seemed as numb as his heart, and grown clumsy, as if unwilling to leave the place. And in that, they reflected some part of him. For here he had found his first true home, and had first been treated with any humanity, any dignity. But at the last, it slipped open, and the bare valley lay ahead of them in the last light of the vanishing moon.
Uphill,
said Rock decisively.
He'll think we've taken the forest road, if he cares to go after us.
He looked up at the cascades of the waterfall, and the stare of rocks alongside, no longer icy in the growing thaw. From the summit of the first fall, a long ledge led back to the crest of the pass.
Might save ourselves a step that way, allowing we don't miss a longer one, if you take my meaning. Well, are you game?
It made little enough difference to Alv, and he clambered up obediently after Rock. They were both climbers of experience from their excursions with the mastersmith, and much stronger than the run of young men their age. Rock's weight told against him, and he was puffing and blowing before they reached the top. But Alv hardly seemed to notice the effort. He sat patiently and waited while Rock bathed his scarlet face in the fall, yelping with the chill, and when they set off again, trailed after him as before, saying no word. They came upon thick snow as they neared the summit of the pass, for it was above the margin of the mountain's snow crest at that season. Alv trudged through it unnoticing, but as they breasted the summit, he seemed suddenly stricken. He leaped at Rock, seized his arm, and threw him violently down in the snow. Gray-faced and panting, he pointed down into the pass below. Into the pass beneath. Rock's angry outburst died on his lips. 100 feet or so below him stood a tall boulder, just where the road across the pass flanked a steep drop. The moon had fallen below the mountains now, but snow glimmer and the lightning sky were enough to show the shape that lurked in its shadow. A human shape, its face hidden from him, but not its dark robes, and he knew them at once. "Our late beloved master," he whispered. "May he wait there for us till he freezes." He made to get up, but Alv pulled him down. "Not for us, or he would be waiting on the other side of the boulder. Sst!" Rock's eyes widened, and he flattened himself down in the snow. Further along the slope, just below the level of the ledge, a shadowy group of figures had appeared round the side of the mountain, marching sure-footedly down the steep snowbank towards the road. Alv caught his breath. They were unmistakably the same strange shapes the mastersmith had dealt with before, whom he had taken for mountain spirits, or something of the kind. But as they passed below him, they sounded all too solid, with a crisp crunch of boots in the snow. He heard their voices, too, speaking a tongue he did not recognize, gruff and peculiar, but not in any way sinister. There was even a brief burst of laughter, silenced by a sharp word from the head of the column. There might have been 30 or 40 of them, and from the tall shafts many of them shouldered, and the subdued metal jangle of their gear, Alv judged them to be a party of warriors. They came to the road, and their boots rattled and clattered on the ancient stones as they headed up the pass, and the first dawn glimmer filled the sky. Then Alv and Rock realized who it must be that the mastersmith awaited. A kind of sick apprehension grew on Alv as he saw the mastersmith step out from behind the rock into their path, though they were still some 100 paces away. He spoke, and then the leader of the column, quiet words, but angry words. That was clear. Then Alv saw the mastersmith snatch something from his shoulder and cast aside its wrapping, and the ice glow gleamed on the strange blade he himself had completed only 5 or 6 hours since. For an instant, Alv's mind writhed in torments as twisted as the substance of the sword. His skills, his learning, his very life he owed to the man who waited below, though he had long since lost any illusions about why they were given. He had seemed useful, that was all. But whatever his motives, it was the mastersmith who had first treated him with any human decency. A metal once alloyed is not so easily made pure. A great debt there remained. And these night shapes, what did he owe them? They were many against one, and well armed, against an untried weapon of a different kind. But something deeper in him, some clearer sight, saw differently. Everything about the smith seemed colored with a treachery blacker than the shadows he lurked in. A menace darker by far than the bluff and open manner of the warriors. Rightly or wrongly, Alv could bear it no longer. Before Rock could catch him, he sprang up, cupped his hands, and yelled. His voice rang between the mountainsides. "No! Get you back! Get away! The blade has a power!" The little knot of figures scattered in the instant the blade was leveled at them. Bounding up the mountainside with the speed of squirrels. Only the leader and 3 or 4 others failed to run in time, or perhaps stood their ground regardless. Nothing visible happened, but something seemed to pass across them with the force of a blow. They crumpled before it, staggered and howled as if in agony or madness. The leader tottered to one side, clutching at his head, and stepped straight out over the side of the road. Another ran wildly in a circle, slipped, and went skidding out after him. The others tumbled threshing into the snow, heaved, and lay still. And in the next second, the blade swung up towards Alv and Rock. Panic descended on them both like a cloud, and they turned and fled wildly up the mountainside. They ran and ran, slithering and tumbling in the snow, barging blindly into rocks and into each other, hardly seen. It was accident only, perhaps, that they ran in the same direction and passed behind a tall outcrop of the cliff into deep shadow. Without warning, hard hands grabbed them and forced them struggling to the ground. With all their strength, they could not break free, nor could they reach their swords. A lantern flickered, and a burst of yellow light shone in their eyes. Alv stared at the ring of faces that bent over his. Strange faces, all with the same cast, broad and coarse-featured with heavy brows. Some were grim and gnarly, some round and wrinkled like a winter apple, and one alone was smooth-skinned, snub-nosed, a girl's face, grinning. Then the light vanished, and the strong hands scooped them up in the air, bouncing them along to the crash and crunch of boots and snow. Alv, too confused to struggle, felt the icy air flow past him at an incredible rate, and realized he was being carried up the slope towards the mountain crest. But all of a sudden, the air became warmer, and the echo louder, and the shadow around him as deep as midnight. For what seemed like hours, he was bumped and bounced along, and the only recognizable thing he heard over the grind of boots was an occasional strangled protest from Rock. Then, equally abruptly, he was pitched forward on his face. Something hard struck him in the small of his back as he tried to get up, and the mountain seemed to collapse onto his legs. But as it struggled away, he realized it was Rock. He sat up, and the light flicked on again in front of him. There was the girl's face, grinning impishly, and a hand waving. With a final roguish waggle of her eyebrows, she receded into shadow, and the light went out. From some distance away they heard, or more truly felt, a soft, heavy impact, and then nothing. Alf could do nothing but sit there and stare stupidly into the darkness. It had all happened too quickly. After a moment he felt the wind on his face, and realized he was out of doors. Still, or again? But it had been on the edge of dawn when they seized him, and here it was dark. He turned and looked around, and saw the peak of a mountain silhouetted against grayish clouds, and others to left and right. But in front of him there were none. "We're on the other side of the peaks," he said wonderingly. "And further down. The sun's not reached here yet."
"Don't be daft,"
gurgled Rock, sitting up next to him.
"You know that'd be a long day's climb from the house. A week by the forest roads."
"Be still, then," said Alv softly, "and see, for dawn is upon us." And before long, the clouds above were turning to white, the sky to gray, and then blue, bright blue, and in the clear air the land spread out before them. They sat at the high head of a mountain valley, on barren rock, among the last thin shreds of snow. But not far below them, green growth circled a small lake, and below it another, and another, all the way down the valley like a giant's stair, until at last all they saw was a glimmer of blue water between the burgeoning trees.
"We're away,"
whispered Rock, in utter awe.
"We're only a morning's march from the lowlands. We've a head start. We're safe."
"Yes," said Alv, "we're safe." And he bowed his head upon his knee.